Hey, well, welcome to everybody. Glad you could make it. We're very honored today because we have Rudi, Camerer and Judith. Judith, I never know whether to say your name is Maida or Marda or what.
It was actually Marda.
Marda, okay, Judith, yeah. Marda. Okay, vielen Dank, thank you.
It doesn't matter, I don't mind, you can say
okay.
Anyway.
And what they're addressing today is the Council of Europe's new CEFR, okay, CV, and whether it is just the old stuff all over again, or whether there is something new about it. This is a very important development, because when the framework of reference, the Council of Europe framework of reference was originally developed way back, okay? Basically, it set out the way in which we should think about language and became universally adopted. But around 2018, 2019, they changed it, and Rudi was on the committee. I think, Judith, you were too, and actually helped reorganize the way we should be looking at this. So I'm absolutely delighted that this fundamental, I'm going to use the word syllabus, I know people disagree and I completely respect, but framework anyway, which influences so many countries around the world in their design of curriculum and their work on textbooks, etc. I'm delighted you two are able to address that today. Rudi and Judith and I have known each other for a number of years and met at conferences mainly, but one thing I don't miss every month is his newsletter, the ELC newsletter, which actually does bring you up to date every single month on research and is always a very, very good read and very, very useful. So I know we're going to have a fascinating session, and I don't know who begins. So Rudi and Judith, over to you.
It's me, actually. I'm beginning. We're taking it in turns all the way through. Rudi, would you like to share your screen?
Yes, I'll do that.
My camera, or there's something wrong with the connection. I don't know. We don't really know why, but I may have to turn my camera off for a minute and turn it on again. But anyway, I'll start. Thank you very much, Barry, for that great introduction. And you said a few things that we're actually not going to say, which are still very important. So thanks very much for setting the scene. And thank you all for coming today. Yeah, this is more or less our agenda for today. We're both great fans of the CEFR, old and new. And I am a user, let's say. I've used it a lot in my teaching. I was the head of languages at a university in Frankfurt and implemented it, the old CEFR a lot, and the new one. I've read it, and I think I know it fairly well. But Rudi, as many of you will know, is the real expert because he, with Jürgen Quetz, worked on the translation from English into German. And as you know, if you've translated, which I'm sure many of you have to actually read every word and think about every word and think about what it means. So he is actually the true expert rather than me, but I think I also have a little bit to say about it. I'm also a trustee of IATEFL. Barry mentioned conferences, and IATEFL, the International Association of Teachers for Teachers of English as a Foreign Language, is a very important association, and I'm very proud to be a trustee for another year. And I'd encourage you all to have a look into it if you're not familiar with IATEFL's work. So to move on very quickly, we're planning to talk for about 45 minutes and then have some time at the end for questions. So we're basically just going to be, unfortunately, talking at you. So save your questions till the end. Rudi, would you like to add anything to that?
No, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, because I introduced you as well, but you'll be saying quite a lot during the session. Okay, so just a little bit to set the scene for what we're talking about, and something which has developed very quickly over the last few years are digital tools and online tools for learning and using languages. There are more or less two sorts. There are the translation tools like DeepL and Google Translate. And then there are the learning tools like Babble, which has 10 million users, 10 million learners using Babble to learn a language. And that tripled, I think, during the pandemic. And Duolingo, which has 50 million users, probably because it has a lot more for free. I use Duolingo, I'm using it to learn Spanish, and it suits my purposes brilliantly. So there's a big question behind all this, actually. What are the implications for language learning? And the other big thing at the moment, as I'm sure you've heard and read about, is open AI, artificial intelligence, ChatGPT. Rudi, do you want to say a couple of words about this? Because I must admit, don't know an awful lot about it. I've heard about it, read about it.
Well, I'm sure everyone has heard about it, and perhaps you even tried it. The future is now, actually. And looking back 4 years, when the boss of DeepL, that's a company based in Cologne who operate a Lingui, was quoted in the Spiegel saying, "Today more languages are translated by machines than by humans. It's no longer unthinkable that we will move from an online translator to an in-ear implant, which understands all languages and provides real-time translation, just like the famous Babble fish in Douglas Adams' science fiction novel, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy." That was 4 years ago.
Yeah, and this, of course, raises very important questions for us as language teachers, which I'm sure many of you are. I consider myself a language teacher, an English teacher, basically. Does this mean that foreign language teaching is threatened with extinction? Something to think about. In the context of this webinar, we don't really have time to discuss this in detail, but it may well be something that you've thought about, and I think about it quite a lot because of my learning experience with Duolingo. So what does this mean, and where does the companion volume to the Common European Framework, and indeed the original Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, come into all this? What's the added value if we're all going to be extinct anyway?
Yes,
So
the key word is the added value, since you have IT-based technology at a level of quality which was unthinkable 10 years ago. So what is the future of foreign language teaching? And one of the most important answers is given by the new CFR. But before we go into this more deeply, I would like to point out that the Council of Europe, who issues the CFR and has issued it since 2001, is not a teacher training college. It's a political body until March last year with 47 member states. In March, Russia and Belarus left the Council of Europe. A few weeks later, they would have been expelled by the other members. But the point I'm making is the CFR primarily is a language political document, and only then a language pedagogical one. And I was personally involved in my very modest way back in 2001 when the first issue came out, and it was unthinkable in those days what great success story the CFR would be. Today there are 40 translations, among translations into Arabic, Chinese, Korean, and did I say Arabic? Yeah.
You did.
So 40 languages. And at the same time, there was another side to this success. This was the not so successful story, because some very, very basic misunderstandings occurred in receiving the CFR the world over. And the first misunderstanding refers to the words printed in red here, because on page 1, you read in 2001 this sentence: "In an intercultural approach, it is a central objective of language education to promote the favorable development of the learner's whole personality and sense of identity in response to the enriching experience of otherness in language and culture." That was on the first page, and when you leaf through the CFR 2001, you come across the word intercultural again and again. And there was even a chapter describing the intercultural personality. That had been completely overlooked. What has also been overlooked was that 1 year later, this book in the middle, Developing the Intercultural Dimension in Language Teaching, was brought out by the Council of Europe. Nobody ever actually got aware of it. And then it's 2016, the book on the right-hand side, The Guide for the Development and Implementation of Curricula for Plurilingual and Intercultural Education. So all this was more or less overlooked. The second thing that was overlooked, and Judith will talk more about this, is represented in these 6 steps, which you find everywhere, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but it's quite clear this is not how the CFR was meant to be used. Because what these 6 steps represent is basically one scale of descriptors, the global scale. And now over to you, Judith.
And as probably most of you or all of you know, the descriptors, of which there are several, I'll come to that in a minute, are one source only for the development of standards appropriate to the context. And we'll be saying a lot more about the importance of the context in the course of the next half hour or so. These are not themselves offered as standards, and like the whole document, they're a basis for reflection, discussion, and further action. The most important thing here is standards appropriate to the context, rather than moving in a sort of automated way from one level to the next and covering everything, which, as probably all of you know, is more or less impossible anyway. There are a large number of scales in the original volume, about 54, in the new companion volume, 80. And here are a few examples of things that we don't always think about when we're thinking about language learning, monitoring and repair, compensating, external context of use. The things that many of us, I feel, in the past, and I'd count myself among this group, have focused on is linguistic accuracy. And out of these 54 scales, only 4 are concerned with linguistic accuracy, with pronunciation, vocabulary, orthography, and grammar. So what does this say about language use and language use in context? What we really need, and this is an example of a project that we worked on for a company, is what's referred to in the companion volume as a spiky profile. Each of us and each learner, user of a language, needs different skills for the context they're working in. They have a different starting point and their aims are also different. And here you can see what we developed is the starting point of any individual learner or group of learners, and the point that they wish to reach or that they're required to reach. And this is how the CEFR was intended to be used. So that's one of the big misunderstandings that Rudi referred to in the earlier slide.
That was the major reason why the new version of the CFR was issued. It didn't take 30 years this time as it did before 2001, but only 5 or 6 after the first edition appeared, 2 more. So 6 years in all, because thanks to the internet, of course. The other reason why it had to be overhauled was that the native speaker construct was still sometimes used in the old issue. And that was correctly criticized by the English as a lingua franca section. They were absolutely right in criticizing this. And that is another point that's gone now. But the most important change occurs at this level. The text as social action, that was the headline back in 2001 too. That wasn't absolutely new, but still it's a programmatic title. We are looking at language as social action. And the 4 domains, you're familiar with those. And this is what the 4 macrofunctions used to be: speaking, listening, writing, and reading. And that's precisely where the change occurs now. In the companion volume, the macrofunctions are reception, production, interaction, and mediation. And that has a very good reason, because when we look at speaking, listening, writing, and reading, we're focusing on the individual user of language. Whereas when we look at reception, production, interaction, and mediation, we look at several users of language co-constructing meaning. And that is the key word of the new version of the CFR, co-construction of meaning. And when we look at how several people use language in order to co-construct meaning, context play a crucial role. And that is why we'll come back to context again and again. In the past, and perhaps to a large extent even today, contexts are usually not addressed. They're just assumed. Very often when we talk about English language teaching, it's a British American context. Context includes all kinds of things like social, cultural, economic, but also personal, etc. So that is the biggest step forward, looking at text as social action in terms of co-constructing meaning. And now over to you, Judith.
Yeah. So the two main things to remember are context and co-construction of meaning. So we're always talking about more than one person being involved in the use of language. So what we need is standards appropriate to the context and context relevant competence profiles, which is much the same thing as the spiky profile I mentioned earlier. This is figure 7 from the companion volume. It's a fictional context, a postgraduate learner of English or another language, any language, postgraduate natural sciences student. And you can see here the levels and the 4 macro functions and examples of the different scales. This is quite complex, but if you think about how you have learned and how you use a language, you'll see that you're not, I know that I'm not, at the same level in every single one of the scales, whether I choose some myself or whether I look at all of them. There are various things that I don't need to do, I've never done, and I may never do. So they can just be more or less ignored. And there are some that are very important that I need to be able to do extrememely well, related to the context that I'm in and the people that I'm communicating with.
May I come in for a moment, Judith?
Yeah.
Because I find the large number of scales indicated in this diagram a bit, well, frightening actually, because when you design a curriculum or a test, all you would need to concentrate on is, let's say, 2 handful of scales. This is not really practical to look at 24 or 25 scales, but it illustrates the approach that's suggested by the CFR.
Okay, I think we can move on to the next slide. I think you're operating the slides. And here we can see the different levels and how sociolinguistic appropriateness as one of the scales is dealt with, for instance, in B1 and in B2. And again, bearing in mind the context and the co-construction of meaning. At B1, a learner, a user can perform and respond to a wide range of language functions using their most common exponents. This is more or less the same as the original CEFR. And at B2, a learner can express themselves confidently, clearly, and politely in formal, informal register appropriate to the situation, i.e. the context and the persons concerned. So again, it's the context that's the most important thing. And the communication, the co-construction of meaning, which leads us into, and this is again you, Rudi, a little excursus.
A little excursus indeed into communication theory, because
yeah.
I think that's important to understand why the CFR has developed along these lines. Because 50 years ago, this book appeared both in English and in German by Watzlawick, Bevan, and Jackson, and has been a generic book ever since then, because they suggested 5 axioms of human communication. And the first one you are absolutely familiar with is this one. We cannot not communicate. Whenever we see anyone, no matter what we do or don't do, no matter what we say or don't say, it will be interpreted. So it bears meaning. That is axiom number 1 of the 5. And axiom number 2 connects directly with that. And it says, whenever we communicate, and remember, we cannot not communicate, we sometimes exchange information, but only sometimes. What we always do without exception is we negotiate our identities, roles, and relationships. We always do this first. And the question whether we get information through, will be successful in getting things done, very much relies on the fact whether we can establish a positive relationship. That is what is called the social constructivist approach that has been accepted in practically all cultural disciplines since the 1970s, early 70s. And just to give you a few examples, Erving Goffman presented or suggested the concept of frames, which define how we communicate and what is meant by that. Berger and Lachman, the title of their main book actually gives it away, The Social Construction of Reality. And Jürgen Habermas, a Frankfurt-based professor, suggested the aspect of hierarchy. So we can only have a reasonable conversation if there's not a great difference of power in it. So the key concept is again summarized by these words, co-construction of meaning. And to be quite frank, in linguistics, that step had been frankly overlooked. Nobody actually took it into account. And just to underline this, a quote from Eleanor Ox, who is a renowned language anthropologist, who in 2005 wrote this: "The constructivist approach to social identity is represented in sociology, anthropology, psychology, and in the history and philosophy of science. Just about the only social science that has not developed a social constructivist paradigm is linguistics." That describes the major step forward as far as the theoretical basics of the CFR are concerned.
So that was more or less setting the scene, because a lot of that referred to, even though much of it was implicit in the original CEFR. So now we're coming to the new CEFR, the companion volume, which can be regarded as the new CEFR. And the main changes in the volume, there is a summary of changes. We're not going to be able to go through all these in this relatively short space of time. So we're going to basically look at three. And one, I just want to say one thing about it, that's phonology. Phonology is important because, as Rudi mentioned earlier, the native speaker as a model or a standard within the companion volume no longer exists. And this was in the original version, the native speaker was mentioned several times as a standard in the scale for phonological control. So that's just one major difference, which we're not actually going to talk about today. And what we are going to talk about are the three of the other changes. Mediation, the first one that Rudi's going to say quite a lot about, and pluricultural and plurilingual competence. We're going to tell you about those, discuss them in some detail. So starting basically with mediation.
Yes, indeed. And mediation is a key term, and it's been discussed in the English language teaching scene very much. And again, there are misunderstandings creeping up again. So let us go into this a bit more deeply. Mediation, as we use it in everyday language, both in English and in German and in many other languages, actually refers to conflict mediation, a three-person communication setup. Conflict mediation is one part of the concept of mediation as suggested by the CFR today, because as we indicated before, mediation refers to the co-construction of meaning. And that's interesting because when we look at this scale called overall mediation, we find descriptions which are rather not linguistic: intervening diplomatically, establishing a positive environment, creating a positive atmosphere, showing interest in empathy. Isn't empathy something referring to personality and can play a supportive role? So it's a different concept of mediation. It's not only conflict mediation.
If I can just intervene diplomatically here,
Yes,
I think the thing about these is that you may possess these capabilities in your own language, but in order to carry them out, you need language. To intervene diplomatically, you do need to use language. So that's the biggest difference between only knowing about intervening diplomatically and being able to use language in an environment with other people to do it. And it's the same for all of these examples that you've shown here. So that language does play a very important role on top of any personality traits.
Yes, that is the basic approach.
Mm-hmm.
This is the general definition which you find. Understanding the other requires an effort of translation from one's own perspective to the other, keeping both perspectives in mind. It doesn't say from one language to another, by the way. Sometimes people need a third person or a third space in order to achieve this. That would be conflict mediation, for example. Sometimes there are delicate situations, tensions, or even disagreements that need to be faced in order to create the conditions for any understanding and hence any communication. And here is a diagram which you find in the companion volume, which I'm not really happy about it. Actually, it had disappeared after the first preliminary edition and now reoccurred in the final edition. This is how in the companion volume mediation is described. I'm not happy because it refers to an individual user of language. but how can you mediate as an individual person? So our suggestion to look at mediation is along these lines: more than one user of language in the act of co-constructing meaning. This is how mediation is meant to be understood. And all these relate to specific context. So just to give you an overview of how this is described in detail, this is taken from page 90 in the companion volume, and it's meant to show the complete construct of mediation. And the first thing to understand is there are actually two constructs of mediation included. One is called cognitive mediation, and these 5 scales on the left had been already included in the CFR 2001. And in several European countries like Germany, Austria, and Spain, they had been used in secondary school education, for example. In Germany, it was called Sprachmittlung, and it actually referred to explaining the contents of a text to someone who didn't quite understand it in your own words. So Sprachmittlung, this part of mediation, is only a fragment of the new construct of mediation. On the right, strategies to explain a new concept and strategies to simplify a text are completely new. And they include things like, all these are scales. These are scales, whereas these in blue are headlines, rubrics. So linking to previous knowledge, adapting language, breaking down complicated information, or amplifying a dense text, streamlining text that will prove extremely interesting and helpful in the context, for example, of academic teaching. But not only there, of course, because you have similar demands in a professional context. The most interesting addition to the concept of mediation is this one, which they call relational mediation. That did not exist in the previous version of the CFR. And it includes things like collaborating in a group, leading group work, but also mediating communication. And that includes scales for facilitating pluricultural space or facilitating communication in delicate situations and disagreements. Now, this might be very confusing at first sight, but this is important to keep in mind. It's virtually impossible to undertake cognitive mediation without taking account of the relational issues concerned. Real communication requires a holistic integration of both aspects. To give you an example, if you are a leader of a group, be it in teaching as a teacher, or be in a corporate context as a team leader, you can only be effective if you know how to communicate in terms of managing interaction, and also know about how to link things to previous knowledge, or to relaying specific information or explaining data. So in real life, you can't separate them, but in teaching, yes, and in testing too. The second remark is also important. Although these scales are directly relevant to the educational domain, they're not confined to the classroom, because they are applicable to all domains where there is a need to move people's thinking forward. And that is what I meant when I referred to the corporate context. Let's have a very quick look at some of the examples. For example, from this scale, linking to previous knowledge. And you remember, this is cognitive mediation. A speaker at B1 can explain how something works by providing examples that draw on people's everyday experience. And this is the point where I would like to draw your attention to Appendix 5. Appendix 5 is part of the book, and you can download the book free from the Council of Europe's website. And the interesting thing about Appendix 5 is that for each of the descriptors for mediation, there are scenarios suggested, roles suggested for each of the 4 domains: personal, public, occupational, educational. So for example, when it comes to relaying specific information in speech or sign refers to sign language. A speaker at A2+ can relay in language B specific relevant information contained in short, simple text, labels and notices in language A on familiar subjects. And here suggestions what a scenario in occupational or educational context might look like. This, to me, is actually a detailed description of what a team manager should be able to do in terms of communicating with his or her team. And since I'm a bit familiar with team management training, this is exactly what's usually lacking. Giving precise can-dos scaled from A1 to C2, what a team manager should be able to do in terms of communication. And I would refer to things like a descriptor from this scale called managing interaction. At B2, I have to move this here, a speaker can explain ground rules of collaborative discussion in small groups that involves problem solving or the evaluation of alternative proposals. And that person can also intervene when necessary to set a group back on task with new instruction or to encourage more even participation. Now, if you ask me, this is precisely what Ed Schein is talking about in practically all of his books. And if you haven't heard of Ed Schein, he is the mentor of corporate psychology and corporate organization. He's not a language person, but he's very experienced and his books are very readable. And I would draw your attention to the title, Humble Inquiry. Humble comes up again and again in his books. So he has an idea based on his experience, what a successful team leader is. And what he calls humble actually is described in detail in the scales, which we just gave to you. So since we asked the question at the very beginning, what is the future of foreign language teaching? One of the answers I would suggest goes along these lines. Coming back to the overview of mediation and having a look at facilitating communication in delicate situations and disagreements. And again, you have descriptors which describe in detail what someone should be able to do in terms of communication. For example, at B1, a speaker can demonstrate their understanding of the key issues in disagreement on a topic familiar to them and make simple requests for confirmation and/or clarification. Or at B2, a speaker can, by asking questions, identify areas of common ground and invite each side to highlight possible solutions. All these are illustrated in Appendix 5, which I repeat is worth looking at and downloading because it does help for curriculum design and test design as well. And of course, it needs to be connected with real life occurrences. And that's over to you now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is an interview that we carried out with Param, who's an experienced intercultural trainer. And he describes a situation where it's obvious to anyone who hears it that some mediation is required. And the question we would use in teaching, in a teaching context, in a lesson, if you like, or in teacher training. Some of you who've been in our courses will have seen this video before. The question is, which skills are needed to deal with a situation like this? And all the skills that are necessary can be found in the Common European Framework, in the companion volume, under the mediation skills. So we're going to play you the video. It's just for you to think about, because unfortunately we don't have time to discuss it a lot, but what you can do if you feel like it is to give some examples of the skills that are needed in the chat so that everyone can see the ideas that you produce. And then we'll come back to this when we've heard the video, seen the video.
I have an example where I was involved. I would not mention names of companies or persons. It was a German company looking for a cooperation or looking for a joint venture with a local Indonesian company to start production and to sell their products in the country itself. And generally what was happening, it turned out that the Indonesian company was taking on the German products, assembling it and then selling it in the country. So the first clash, or not the first clash, the level of communication was that the Indonesians were accepting everything that the Germans were saying or wanting to implement in terms of technology, in terms of specification. That was okay. But the only thing that was different from the Indonesian way of doing things is that people. The Indonesian had put someone into a position who did not have the profile, who did not have the qualification to do this job, and this person could not communicate with the German parties. And the Germans were quite disappointed with this, and they told the Indonesians, look, you put this unqualified person in this position, and this person is not helping us at all in terms of progress. The Indonesians said, yes, he is not qualified right now, but we are training him and would like to put him on the job so that he gains his qualification. And by the way, he's my cousin, so he's related to me, and I would like him to take on the responsibility. And this is where the Germans could not understand it, why someone who is not qualified for the job is doing the job, and it goes into neopolitism. That means bringing in family and friends into the business. But anyway, that was his first clash.
I'm sorry, the video didn't work properly, so you just had the audio, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but you could hear it, I think, and I think understand it. And he mentioned some very important things. He is an experienced intercultural trainer and mediator, but he mentions people and communication. We're going to give you the answers to this. This is clearly a case of different values in Indonesia and in Germany, and the role of what we might think of as nepotism, as a form of corruption in different cultures. And this is exactly what is in the Common European Framework, the companion volume, the skills that are necessary to deal with a situation like this. And here you can see B1 and B2. They're different from each other. In B1, can it support an intercultural exchange, a limited repertoire to introduce people from different cultural backgrounds, showing awareness. And the showing is important because you show this through language, but the awareness is also important, which is the quality that you need to have. It's more of a personality trait, but showing it requires language. And at B2, can exploit the knowledge using language to establish a consensus and can encourage a shared communication culture. So these are exactly the things that Param needs in his work in this sort of situation, of which he has, of course, several examples. And this is the sort of thing that can be used in classes to discuss the skills that are needed, and also the sort of situation that comes up in various different contexts where people from different cultures are involved. So
we might add that this is exactly what ChatGPT cannot do so far. We don't know how long it takes until they'll be able to do that, but that at the moment is exactly the added value that teachers of foreign language can offer.
Yeah, and it's also exactly what Google Translate or translation tools can't do, that you have to type or speak into and then show. You won't get this sort of thing in the communication. You won't get the same co-construction of meaning.
So you might ask yourself, looking at mediation, where is all the linguistic side and sociolinguistic and pragmatic competences? They are there too, and you have to read it in the way that they are placed behind them, before them, beside them. They are part of it, so we have to look at them too. And I'll give you an example for plurilingual comprehension and building on plurilingual repertoire from my own experience, actually, because this episode actually happened. When you go through Frankfurt near the West End campus of the university, you find this mural at one of the buildings there. As will man nicht in my Kopenai, wie kann noch ein Mensch nicht von Frankfurt sei. Those of you who understand German will realize I'm not from Frankfurt, because that's a slight dialect thing. And it loses everything the moment you translate it into standard English, because a translation would be, I just can't get it into my head how anyone can not be from Frankfurt. And that, of course, makes it absolutely not witty, but rather stupid. Well, now imagine the situation which actually occurred. I was leading a visitor from France to Frankfurt, and when he saw this, he asked me what it read, and I told him, I gave him a very, very poor translation in French, and of course he didn't quite understand the joke of it. So I talked about the author of it, because in Frankfurt, these are 2 lines of a very famous poem by a local poet called Friedrich Stolze. And Friedrich Stolze is a local hero in the sense that he has his own museum now in Frankfurt's new Old Town. By the way, Frankfurt has the newest Old Town in Europe. And if you come to Frankfurt, you must see it. And there's his museum. He played a very important role in the 1848 revolution, which took place, well, the first parliamentary, democratically elected parliamentary assembly convened in the Paulskirche, which you see on the right. And he was a witty and sharp commentator. So I would tell him this, my visitor, and perhaps take him to Paulskirche. Frankfurt isn't all that big, you can walk. But I'm not quite sure whether I would talk more about Friedrich Stolze. I'll tell you a little episode about him. Friedrich Stolze was liaised to a woman, not married, for many years, and they had a child together. And the girl was Catholic and he was Protestant. And then after a while, when she was pregnant again, they decided they should get married, and they found a Protestant pastor who married them in the Katharinenkirche. And to thank this pastor, he wrote a 4-line poem, which in German goes like this. Ein Pfarrer hat uns zwar getraut, doch lutherisch diabolisch, und Gott war nicht davon erbaut, denn Gott ist streng katholisch. Und was mich ganz besonders beugt, denn das verdiente Hiebe, die Kinder all, die wir erzeugt, sind Kinder, ach, der Liebe. Which in English is something like this. A priest did marry us indeed, but a Lutheran diabolic. And God was not amused at all, for God's a strict Catholic. And then what really gets me down, and it deserves heart beatings, the children all that we produce came out of loving meetings. So I like this, and I like Friedrich Stolze, he's quite a character. But would I tell my French visitor this episode, not knowing him, not knowing about his attitude to religion? When we met 3-4 times, I would dare tell him this episode, but not in our first meeting. And that is what mediation is about, and looking at pluricultural and plurilingual repertoire. And now over to you, Judith.
Yeah, and what we're going to talk about for the last few minutes of this presentation is how to teach pluricultural and plurilingual competence. Obviously, we can't give you everything that's connected with teaching these competencies, but we would like to produce a few ideas, not all ours, but some that we found very useful. Here are 3 scales, and these 3 are the ones that we're focusing on. And the question, how can you do it? So to start with, one publication, which I believe is downloadable, freely downloadable, the link is here, it's a guide for the development and implementation of curricula for plurilingual and intercultural education. And one of the main tips, and one that we found the most useful, is doing this little by little, gradual, medium, or long-term development, and not break sharply with the existing situation. A lot of these things may be quite new to learners and to teachers as well, to many of us and to other stakeholders in the whole language learning process. So the best approach is to do this little by little, not all or nothing. And the main aim in all this is to teach learners to teach themselves, and to show them how they can learn to mobilize all their language resources. And this can be done. Many learners of any language speak another language, their own or others that they've learned, even if they're not absolutely aware of this all the time. And they can use these and use strategies from these other languages to carry out language tasks in the language that they're learning. And some of the methods that can be used are learning posters, poster presentations, project presentations, and portfolio or an e-portfolio. All these activities can help to develop plurilingual competencies. One thing that we're just highlighting here is internationalisms and words that are common to different languages. For instance, here, house, piecing together what they understand from different languages. These are at low levels, and exploiting what they've understood in different languages. All these can be put to good effect in classrooms, that's the plurilingual comprehension, and connected very closely with pluricultural competence is talking about what certain terms mean to different cultural and national and language groups. For instance, family, quite a different thing. Breakfast is another one. Those are for slightly lower levels, everyday topic, days of the week, and at a more advanced level, and when abstract concepts and more complex concepts can be talked about, liberty. Another very useful one and very popular always is food. And a method that can be used is preparing a poster using words, pictures, sentences. In my experience, even learners at high levels love talking about food. Food festivals is another one, comparison of different festivals that are typical to certain cultures or countries and particular foods. Another thing that can be used, which up to now has always been regarded a little bit as taboo, is transferring, not translating, but transferring information from one language to another language. As many large organizations like the World Wildlife Fund have websites in different languages, and depending on which languages you understand, use, speak best, you can use that information and prepare a poster presentation or a poster or a presentation in the target language, in the language that's being learned. It's the transfer, as I said, not translation, from one language to another, which is the skill that we're trying to develop in learners. Another example, this is more one for Rudi, he thought, so I'll hand it back to you.
We should motivate people by appealing to their hobbies and interests. So football clubs, international football clubs have websites with many languages. So why not ask them to collect all the information they can get about, for example, Bayern München, for just one example, and present them in the target language. And a similar thing would go for Lego. The Lego website is multilingual, so you can get any information in almost any language there. So describe your favorite device in the target language.
And the same thing goes for travel, producing a travel guide to a city you know or a city you don't know in a language, in the language that's being learned, by using information in other languages that you're familiar with. And another example is watching an episode of, for instance, The Simpsons, but it could be Friends, it could be anything that's popular among the learners, and retelling, re-narrating the episode in the target language. For business learners, there are examples from company websites. For example, the corporate culture compliance regulations. This is one from the company Henkel, which has a website in English, and summarizing their compliance regulations. Learners can be encouraged to help each other using any language and prepare a joint presentation in the target language. So these are just a few examples of teaching methods to achieve the goals of plurilingual comprehension, plurilingual competence.
And since you all know language and culture are inextricably connected, building on pluricultural repertoire is another of the scales that can be very positively connected with the mediation scales. Just to give you an example from these scales here, building on pluricultural repertoire, a speaker at B1 can explain features of their own culture to members of another culture, or explain features of the other culture to members of their own culture. So it doesn't take much linguistic repertoire in order to do these. Very briefly, the underlying term culture should be mentioned because there's a lot of disagreement about it, what we mean when we talk about culture. And the approach is actually a social constructivist. Cultures are discourse communities. And just to illustrate this by using this diagram on the bottom right side, a speaker named A or B or C or D relates to several cultures simultaneously. K stands for Kultur in German, and these change as we go through life. So when we talk about our cultures, the plural is essential. And that is essentially the approach suggested by the Council of Europe, and they're not alone in this at all. And that's why this list of names is given here, going back to Wittgenstein, but even going back to Hegel, if you wish. So it's very well based theoretically. Initially, when we started, I referred to the Council of Europe being a political body, which was established after 45 in order to respond to this chaotic, catastrophic events during the first half of the 20th century. And looking at it from today, Europe, as we have come to see it today, is a peace project of historic dimension. And I usually avoid bombastic language, but Europe is a historic success so far. And I don't forget the war in the Balkans in the 1990s. I don't forget the situation which we have in the Ukraine just now. Europe, as we know today, has become a great success because they opened the borders rather than challenging the borders or going to war over borders. In this context, language education plays a key role in establishing something that you might call a European identity. Of course, all major political decisions are taken by the political leaders in Europe, but enabling Europeans to communicate with one another, to understand each other, to accept one another, to establish something like a European identity, that is your and our job in foreign language teaching. That is the most important message of the CFR in its new version. Having said this, final point, where is ICC? Where is Eurolta? I'm just asking this question because I'm not really up to date. What is the construct, the underlying construct of foreign language teaching? What are the standards? Which are the 4 modes? What are the contexts? And what are the cultures? These are the questions we are asking. And finally, over to you again, Judith.
Yeah, we just like to finish off with a short commercial spot because whether you like it or not, English has become the global lingua franca #1. I have mixed feelings about this, but I think it's just something that we have to live with. And this, of course, will affect in particular English language teaching. And so we run a lot of teacher training courses, and we have one coming up in March on teaching English as a lingua franca and things that need to be considered. And of course, we will be involving many of the things that we've talked about here, because communication between cultures often involves English, and English as a lingua franca, not as the native speaker of any of those interacting in the communication. So just a short spot, and all that remains now. We have spoken for a bit longer than we intended, but also because Barry said a lot of useful things at the beginning, which set the scene very nicely. But we still do have a little bit of time for questions. If you have any, you can put them in the chat, or you can put your microphone on and ask them. And yeah, we'd like to thank you very much for your attention and hope to meet you again sometime soon, someplace. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Turn on your mics. And
we have a question in the chat, actually, Rudi. How do you expect these new changes, introduction of new scales, macro functions, to impact language certification procedures? That's actually, if I may answer this one, this is a very interesting question. And so far, we personally have seen very little impact on major language tests that are used, for instance, for university admissions. It's something that we're speaking about at the conference next week. In fact, what you really need in order to be able to study successfully in a foreign language, whatever that is, in another language. We hope, of course, that they will have an impact on testing, but I've been very involved in testing professionally during my career, and I don't think it's necessarily easy, and involves really quite a, what do we say, tectonic change in the way we look at tests. And so I think there's quite a lot of consideration. And of course, people want tests all the time. So we can't just, testing authorities and boards, examination boards, can't just stop everything and wait, all of you wait while we develop a new test. The old test will still continue for a while, but we, Rudi and I and many others, of course, are hoping for major changes in testing and certification procedures. If we move away from the idea of tests as something that you sit down and do for 3 hours and then have an oral test for half an hour or whatever, to possibly more major changes. We hope so anyway.
Yeah, I would agree that it's a question of market players, the big players like ECL and Cambridge. They defend their market, that's clear. And that's particularly remarkable since Cambridge was involved in developing both the CFR 2001 and the Papani volume, but it doesn't reflect at all in their policies so far. So we'll do our best, and I'm quite optimistic that in the field of German universities, we'll get steps forward to get over this monolithic misunderstanding of language competence, which is represented by IELTS, TOEFL, and etc.
And we have another question in the chat. How would be a recommendable way to approach the subject of war and world catastrophes within a multicultural language class? I think this is a very difficult subject, and I don't know. I don't really have an answer. It reminds me of a time when I was learning German a very, very long time ago, when everybody got on really well until the subject of Greece and Turkey and Cyprus came up, and there were quite a lot of Turkish learners in the class and some Greek learners, and they started more or less just going for each other on this subject, although up to then they'd been learning together very happily. So I don't think it's an easy, and I don't know, I just have to say I don't know. I don't know whether, Rudi, you have an idea, but I think there are various topics that have to be approached very, very carefully, and maybe little by little is the answer.
Yes, indeed. And again, the question of trust comes up, because the underlying concept of mediation is how do we establish trusting relationships? And that's not a question of linguistic accuracy at all. And that is the essence of the CFR. How do you establish trusting relationships? And that refers to the teacher-learner situation just as well. And I'm sure you've all had the same experience. If you have a chance of establishing a trusting relationship between you as a teacher and your learners, almost anything goes. So you need to have the time to establish these relationships, then you can address such subjects. But it's a difficult question, I agree.
I think one possible approach, which is a fairly easy thing to do and which I've often done in classes at the beginning of a course, whether they're multicultural or not, is finding things you have in common. Because I think if you find a lot of things in common with someone, you may be able to not necessarily forget or overlook, but put the whole issue of a possible conflict between your two cultures or countries into a certain perspective. And I had a good example of this with two Chinese teachers, one from the People's Republic, the mainland China, and the other from Taiwan, who found they had a lot of things in common. And so their issues about the relationship between China and Taiwan could be just laid aside briefly for the purposes of successful and pleasant communication. It did work, actually. It was things like age, number of children, problems of being a mother of teenagers and things like that. So that may be a possible approach to the question. I see that some people put their cameras on and turn their mics on. Do any of you want to ask a question? Leo, I think you've, and I think Jennifer, Eddie, you had your microphone on for a minute, but Leo, you've been waiting for a while as well.
Just a brief question about pronunciation. This is something that you didn't cover today, but I am constantly asked about. Can you please correct my pronunciation? Obviously, from a British English perspective, I can do that, but from a English as lingua franca perspective, this is problematic. Yeah. How can one correct pronunciation? Yeah. And when I was a Cambridge examiner as well as an IELTS examiner, this was also an issue in the descriptors there. They were difficult to fulfill, put it that way.
Yeah, I think this is one of the important areas where the native speaker standard has disappeared for all languages, not only for English, but it's of course very important particularly in English as a lingua franca, and it is something we're going to address in our training course. But I think it also refers very much to the context, who is actually speaking and understanding each other, and the co-construction of meaning. How successful can you be in establishing what the other person is saying? I realize that this isn't helpful with exams, and it isn't helpful with giving grades, and it may, yeah, I'll come back in a second to the to learners asking you to correct their pronunciation. But I think pronunciation is very, very important, because if you can't understand the way someone pronounces something, it doesn't matter how eloquent they are and how sophisticated their language is, you just can't understand it. It's like illegible handwriting. So it is important, but it's also a case of who can understand and who is speaking. I think as far as correcting pronunciation, it's the same possibly with correcting grammar and correcting vocabulary. It's also a case of little by little, and of raising awareness that these may be, but may not be the most important things in successful communication.
May I perhaps add?
You know, we'd go back to little by little, trying to make learners aware of these aspects of communication, which are actually in the end far more important than.
May I perhaps add one aspect, because raising awareness should be on the receiving end too. So we very easily associate with the way people use a language ideas of these people's intellectual and or social status. So one example we use very often is an interview with an academic from Nigeria, and the way he speaks English, very hard to understand unless you get used to it and you get the time. And our spontaneous interpretation of the speaker tends to be, this is a person of lower social status and or lower intellectual capacities. And we need to raise awareness in that field too, that one does not really go with the other.
But altogether, a difficult question which can't be answered in a couple of minutes, but maybe in the course.
Could I clarify?
Yeah.
Could I?
Yeah,
Could
sure.
I settle one question? I think I recognize that Mr. Camerer is from European Language Competence. And I have been a mute recipient of your communication. In this context, I should like to ask, would it be acceptable to address you by email with questions of the sphere you discussed today as a question of communication?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, we're happy. We're both from ELC, actually from European Language Competence, and we'd be happy to answer questions. The address is on the final slide, and we could put it in the chat, actually, Rudi, if you want to put it in the chat.
Thank you very much.
I was just saying you're following the questions brilliantly, Judith. Thank you so much for doing that. Any other questions you can see, either from hands up or I can't see anything else in the chat at the moment?
No, I can't see anything else in the chat. Sandra, I think I can't see everybody on my screen either.
Yeah, I don't have my video on, but I just want to share a thought. So about pronunciation, for example, I am an English teacher, but of course, English is not my native language, it's Spanish. And when students ask me to correct their pronunciation, I don't know if I have an American accent or a British accent, but rather an Ecuadorian accent. And then what I say, okay, we can analyze, you know, the phonetics. But more than that, try to speak a little bit slowly so people can understand what you say. Maybe your pronunciation won't be perfect because the accent is there. But if you try to speak slowly, and sometimes speakers or students who are in level B1 or B2, they try to speak really quickly, trying to feel more confident about the language, but sometimes it's going to be difficult to understand, maybe by other speakers. Maybe from me, it's going to be easier because I'm also speak Spanish, so it will be easier for me to understand. But maybe someone who is from a different country will be so hard because the accent is still there. I mean, some people try to delete their accents. I think this is another discussion, but it's difficult, right? But what it's easy, maybe it's to be understood, even though you have grammar mistakes, even though you have an accent there. So if you can communicate and you can speak slowly and you can be okay, thinking that this is not your native language, but you can say your message, you can convey a message. So that's what I do when it comes to pronunciation, because it's a difficult thing, even more when you are not a native speaker. Thanks a lot for the very interesting conference.
Yeah, thank you. I think there was someone else who's got their hand up, but I can't see at the moment who it is. Maybe not. But another thing, I'd just like to say something about pronunciation as well. Like many things in language learning, it's a question of practice. I think speaking more slowly is one way, but it is also a question of practice. And the more you practice, the more you are able to produce things, to pronounce things and to say things in a comprehensible way. Personally, I don't think it means getting rid of an accent. I don't particularly care if people can hear that I'm not a native German speaker and can hear that I'm from the UK, or many think I'm from America. That actually I don't see as a big problem, as long as I can be understood. But a lot of it I can remember from my experience of learning German is practice, repeating things and practicing sounds. And if learners are prepared to do this, then they will become more comprehensible. And also, yeah, exactly, Ali, comprehensibility is more important than how fast or how fast you speak the language or how much you sound like a native speaker. There's actually no real need for that, and having an accent is inevitable. Yeah, exactly as you put it. It's more or less inevitable. Some people do manage to get rid of their accent, but others never do, and it doesn't really matter.
My friends from Scotland are native speakers, but you can hardly understand them.
Be careful of that one. There is a thing called political correctness in Europe. Don't go there.
Yes, yeah. But I mean, I've heard that from learners as well. It was in the very dim and distant past that you know, he speaks very bad English just because he's from the north of England. I too am from the north of England, but I haven't lived there for so long that you probably can't hear it anymore. But you know, it is very politically incorrect to talk about.
It's a very important issue that needs to be discussed with learners and with teachers and with decision makers. Most of all, decision makers are very important in this field too, both in academic institutions and in companies.
Yeah, I mean, I started teaching so long ago, and I don't think I think there are fewer cases of this, but learners were saying, I want to speak Queen's English. And at that time, certainly I could point out to them that there was only one person who spoke Queen's English, that was the Queen, who is sadly no longer with us. So now there is nobody who speaks Queen's English.
Okay, well, I think the point is very well made, and I think both you, Judith, and Rudi, and also our our viewers have made a very good point about the whole thing is not going too fast, and also allowing, really working on your comprehensibility, whatever your accent or whatever your background is. I think that's really, really important. As Ali says, having an accent is naturally inevitable. Okay, so I'll buy that. Now we've gone over, which is because it is so interesting. We've gone slightly over our time. I don't know whether Rudi or Judith, you have any final comment you want to make before we hand it back to Thomas and to Lillian to close the session down.
No, I think we've actually spoken far too much and said everything that we want to say at some length. And yeah, I think we would also like to thank you, I'm speaking for me and Rudi, for being such attentive listeners and for all your kind words and questions and comments in the chat and in the audio. And hope to be able to continue these discussions with you.
I'm sure we'll be doing that. And again, thank you so much for participating. And I would say to everybody, go on to the ELC website, because whether you are committed to joining a program or not, the information you'll get will be fascinating and very useful. So thank you both very much again.
Thank you.
Okay, and on that note, let me pass the microphone, as they say on the radio, back to Lillian and to Thomas.
Let me just highlight the next talk, which will be given by Dr. Julio Jimenez from the University of Westminster in London. He'll be talking about teaching and learning during the pandemic, lessons learned, present practices, and new opportunities. This will be the next webinar taking place on the 30th of March. And then there'll be the ICC conference, the 30th annual ICC conference. And Barry, would you like to say anything about this conference, which is highly promising and will be highly interesting, if I may say so, although I'm biased as an ICC board member, of course.
Well, we have been online for the last few years because of the pandemic, but this year will be once again the opportunity to do face-to-face, and this time in Belgrade in Serbia. And we are now looking for participation. So if you want to attend, or if you would like to offer a paper for presentation and discussion in the conference, go to ICClanguages.eu conferences, and you'll see all the details and also the call for proposals for talks. The deadline is March the 31st. And the dates are May the 13th and the 14th. The 13th will have both online and in face-to-face presentations, whereas the 14th will be much more people discussing face-to-face. So if you want to do something online, it'll be for May the 13th. And if you want to be able to attend the whole conference, your opportunity is there on May the 13th and the 14th. And I'm sure you'll find it very, very valuable. I find these conferences very, very useful indeed. Okay, Thomas, back to you.
And thank you very much, Barry. And we are also going to talk about ChatGPT, not to forget that. Okay.
ChatGPT is going to change the face of testing, teaching,
indeed,
essay writing, and my God, who knows what.
And the rest of all our lives. That's true. So anything. I just read an article these days, and it said that ChatGPT is actually the same, or has the same importance as human beings learning how to write back in history. So that's quite interesting, I guess.
Don't go there, because that's a subject all on its own. Margarita has just said, in order to attend the conference, do you have to be a member of ICC? And the answer is no, you don't. You can take part as an individual, a teacher, or whatever.
Okay,
Good.
so Barry, the ball is back to you immediately.
Well, very, very, very briefly, we have a 3 times a year academic publication. Rudi and Judith, we will be summarizing your talk with your permission, and having had you check out the text in our next issue. And also we'll have our special issue devoted to the conference. Comes out 3 times a year. We're trying to get it up to its 4 times a year if we can. And volume 5 is now about to start. It's recognized by EBSCO, and we're looking for recognition from Google Scholar and other organizations. So if you're interested in writing on teaching ideas, reviewing books, and presenting your own research, we would be very interested to hear from you. Okay.
Thank you. And then we come to you, Walter. Miriam, are you there? And would you like to say anything about that?
Thank you, Rudi and Judith. It was lovely seeing you again. And it was nice, as you mentioned, Uralta. We'll be starting a new course on the 4th of March. So if anybody is interested in our teacher training program, you can still register. And we will look into the old CEFR, but also in the companion volume. And since Uralta is extremely practical, we'll be looking at ideas of how to integrate, for example, activities with mediation into the classroom. That's all I can say at the moment.
So I think on that note, I think we'll finish the seminar. Thank you again, Rudi and Judith. I think you've done a fantastic job of really raising some very complicated issues which we need to address. And I think you're quite right. The organizations teaching languages in so many cases have not yet caught up. And there's a lot of work to be done. So Rudi, I'm very glad you made that point. Okay, so everybody, I think it is time to close the meeting, and the recording will be online in a few days. And also, as I said, we'll be publishing a summary of what Rudi and Judith have had to offer. So you all have ways of following up on what's happened this afternoon. Thank you again. We wish you a wonderful weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in a month's time with Dr. Julio Jimenez. Say bye-bye for now. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.